Truth Unveiled here, and today I have so much stuff to share with you. We're going to be talking about all of the draconian laws that your president has signed into office this past week, and once again elaborating on these things as we're on the tail end of Hurricane Harvey and watching also Tropical Storm Irma. Now, I briefly talked about this yesterday in my Hurricane Harvey video and the truth behind it. I briefly mentioned these things about Trump lifting the ban on military gear to local police force, talking about what the militarization of the police, and we're going to elaborate more on that right now. Now we'll briefly go over the article from USA Today that says, the Trump administration lifted a controversial ban on the transfer of some surplus military equipment to police departments whose battlefield-style response to rioting in a St. Louis suburb 3 years ago prompted a halt to the program. The new plan takes place effective immediately and fully rolls back an Obama administration executive order that blocked armored vehicles, large caliber weapons, ammunition, and other heavy equipment from being repurposed from foreign battlefields to America's streets. And we're going to be taking a look at the summary of that executive order later on in this video to come. But Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and we'll also be seeing his remarks, who led the campaign for the program's reinstatement, outlined President Trump's new executive order this week in an address to who? The Fraternal Order of the Police, the nation's largest police union, suggesting that Obama's directive was a concession to political pressure applied by civil rights activists. The report goes on to say, quote, "We will not put superficial concerns above public safety," he told the group gathered in Nashville, Tennessee. "All you need to do is turn on the TV right now to see that for Houstonians, that this isn't about appearances, it's about getting the job done and getting everyone to safety." And Sessions also made a statement how they're already implementing this in places in Texas with the militarization of the police. It's already started, folks. But then it goes on to say, the Attorney General referred to post-hurricane rescue effort underway in Houston, and we know that Hurricane Harvey was in fact a man-made storm problem reaction solution where military vehicles and helicopters, part of the Texas National Guard, were deployed to assist in the massive response, more like 30,000 members of the Texas National Guard. Do you see what they're doing? They're using another excuse to do what? Bring in the military, bring in the militarization of the police and reinstitute all of the weaponization to go along with it. And they're using Hurricane Harvey, a man-made storm, as an excuse to do so. Because this is practice and preparation for martial law. This is just yet another test run, as we see. But then it goes on to say, the administration's action, first disclosed by USA Today, would restore, quote, "the full scope of a long-standing program for recycling surplus, life-saving gear from the Department of Defense." What life-saving gear? It's the exact opposite. And they're getting it from who? The Department of Defense, the DOD, the same alphabet soup that's funding these FEMA camps behind closed doors, along with restoring the full scope of grants used to purchase this type of equipment from other sources, according to an administration summary of the new program. Quote, "assets would otherwise be scrapped can be repurposed to help state, local, and tribal law enforcement better protect public safety and reduce crime." But is that really what they're trying to do? Included in the gear are such things as rocket launchers and bayonets. According to the Trump plan, the bayonets would likely be repurposed as utility knives and the launchers used to shoot tear gas canisters instead of lethal ammunition. Why would they need any of this if they're claiming to protect the people? It sounds like they're doing something else. Now we're also going to briefly go over some of the remarks that Attorney General Jeff Sessions made at the 63rd Biennial Conference of the National Fraternal Order of Police, and this was in Nashville, Tennessee earlier this week, only 3 days ago, and the exact same day as when Trump passed his executive order, which we're also going to be looking at. Now, the speech itself is about 21 minutes long. I'll be sure to link it in the description box below, but if you pay careful attention, you'll see how throughout the speech, Sessions makes references and is constantly alluding to why they need this program to be reinstituted. And the main reason that session cite has to do with gang references, drug wars, and this is constantly brought up throughout the entire speech. Do you see how this is controlled opposition? Because the government, yes, your government and your alphabet soups, the CIA and the FBI and all those other ones, they fund the drug wars that you see going on, and they fund many of the gang wars that you see courtesy the Zionists. So once again, this is a problem reaction solution because they cause the problem and offer their own solution of what? Martial law, bringing in the military and military equipment for the police. And what you're going to find out is that the police is linked with Freemasonry, and you're going to see the subliminals right now, actually.
It's an honor for me to be with you. 330,000 members, largest worldwide group dedicated to law enforcement. So I want to thank you for that. President Trump is serious about this mission. He is doing all he can to restore law and order and support our police across America. And that's why I'm here today. One reason, to announce that President Trump this day is issuing an executive order that will make it easier to protect yourselves and your communities. And it's a top priority of Chuck and your leaders. He is rescinding restrictions from the prior administration that limited your agency's ability to get equipment through federal programs. To make your lives safer, like Kevlar vests and helmets, first responder and rescue equipment, like they're using in Texas right now, like they're using in Texas right now, like they're using in Texas right now, like they're using in Texas right now.
Here's the actual executive order that Trump passed on this just a few days ago. As you can see right here, it says Presidential Executive Order on Restoring State, Tribal, and Local Law Enforcement's Access to Life-Saving Equipment and Resources. And we know it's the exact opposite of what they're saying. Now, this isn't a long executive order, so we'll go over it together. So it says right here, Restoring State, Tribal, and Local Law Enforcement's Access to Life-Saving Equipment and Resources. Section 1 calls for the revocation of Executive Order 13688, which Obama passed in early 2015. Of federal support for local law enforcement equipment acquisition is hereby revoked. And later on in the video, we're going to be talking more about that executive order. And part of what it outlined, Section 2 talks about the revocation of recommendations issued pursuant to Executive Order 13688. The recommendations issued pursuant to that executive order do not reflect the policy of the executive branch. All executive departments and agencies are directed, as of the date of this order and consistent with federal law, to cease implementing those recommendations and, if necessary, to take prompt action to rescind any rules, regulations, guidelines, or policies implementing them. And then it says general provisions. Nothing in the order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect the authority granted by law to an executive department, agency, or the head, or the functions of the director of the Office of Management and Budget relating to budgetary, administrative, or legislative proposals. The order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to availability of appropriations, and is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the U.S., its departments, agencies, or entities, its officers, employees, or agents, or any other person. And I'll be sure to leave this in the description box below. And now we're going to briefly look at Executive Order 13688, which is what Obama signed as of 2015, but has since been revoked by Trump. And this says recommendations pursuant to that executive order, federal support for local law enforcement equipment acquisition. Now, this is a 50-page report, and towards the end of this report, it also contains the actual 3-page executive order that Obama passed, and I'll be sure to link it in the description box below. Now, it says here on 1/16/2015, ironically enough, 1/16 is what? 9/11. Obama issued this executive order, quote, federal support for local law enforcement equipment acquisition to identify actions that can improve federal support for the appropriate use, acquisition, and transfer of controlled equipment by state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies, or LEAs. The EO established the Federal Interagency Law Enforcement Equipment Working Group, which consulted with stakeholders and deliberated to develop the recommendations described in this report. Now, of course, we're not going to go over all of it, but to summarize, it says that it established the federal government-wide prohibited equipment list. Now, this is very important because you're going to see what items were once prohibited that the police could not attain, but now actually can thanks to Trump. It says the prohibited equipment list identifies categories of equipment that law enforcement agencies will not be able to acquire via transfer from federal agencies or purchase using federally provided funds, e.g., tracked armored vehicles, bayonets, grenade launchers, large caliber weapons, and ammunition. But all of these things that are listed right here, now your police can in fact get these things and they can attain it from your government. Now they have the right to get these things, and they're even using these things in Texas as we speak. And we know darn well that your government is not taking care of so-called low-income neighborhoods when it comes to the flooding in Texas and certain parts of Houston. And so what are they doing? They're going to these areas and they're bringing in these weapons in these areas in so-called black neighborhoods in order to do what? To call in the military and martial law, and soon enough place them into what? FEMA camps. It's one great big test. It's a test of what? Genocide is all it is. Here we go again. Now we're actually seeing the plans in action, and it's no surprise that they also placed a curfew in the Houston area. Do you think that's a surprise or a coincidence? They're not going to call it martial law, but call it what it is. But this is the prohibited equipment list that's now effective. They also established the federal government-wide controlled equipment list and also the harmonization of federal acquisition processes. This executive order also required information collection and retention for controlled equipment use in significant incidents, approval for third-party transfers or sales, increase in federal government oversight and compliance. And if you go to page 8, here are a list of categories that the executive order is broken down into. It includes equipment lists, policies, training, and protocol for controlled equipment, acquisition process for controlled equipment, the transfer, sale, return, and disposal of controlled equipment, along with oversight, compliance, and implementation. Now, if you look at Appendix B on page 48 of the document, this gives a list of federal equipment acquisition programs, one of which we're going to be talking about, and that's this one right here, the 1033 program, which is multiple federal agencies and programs providing equipment to law enforcement agencies through direct transfers or through funding. So this is what? Funding the militarization of the police. And here they have listed by your lovely Department of Defense, the DoD, the same organization getting ready and funding these FEMA camps, but they allow the transfer without charge of excess DoD property to law enforcement agencies. And some of the things that they include are small arms, night vision devices, high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles or Humvees, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, aircraft, and watercraft. And again, the question is, why do they need all of this stuff if they're just so-called protecting the people? What are they really doing behind closed doors? Are they planning massive genocide, and have they been planning massive genocide for many decades now, along with the fallen ones who they're teaming up with, in order to fulfill the UN's Operation Depopulation via Agenda 21? Is that what they're doing? Let's find out, because another grant they have when it comes to acquisition programs is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, another alphabet soup that's also vehemently preparing for martial law. Their Homeland Security Grant Program, or HSGP. There's also the U.S. Department of Justice's Assistant Grant Program, or the JAG. Then there's the Department of Justice, or the DOJ Equitable Sharing Program, or the ESP. There's also the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Forfeiture Funds Equitable Sharing Program, or the TFF, more alphabet soups. Also General Service Administrations, or the GSA Federal Surplus Personal Property Donation Program, and the U.S. Department of Interior, the DOI. And the question I have for you is, where are they getting all of this technology? Where are they acquiring all of these firearms and vehicles like never before? I'll give you a hint. We wrestle not against flesh and blood because your government is working hand in hand with entities behind closed doors who are going to disguise themselves as so-called aliens for a deception to come. And they've been conspiring for many deceptions and delusions for how many years now? But now we're going to be talking about the 1033 program, which is one of the ways that your local law enforcement agencies are funded. It says that it was created by the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 1997. And by the way, the NDAA is the same act that also talks about what? The funding of FEMA camps as part of the U.S. government's Defense Logistics Agency Disposition Services, or DLA, to transfer excess military equipment to civilian law enforcement agencies, and it was signed into law by President Bill Clinton as of what date? September 23rd, 1996? Oh, and then on September 23rd, 2017, 21 years later, just so happens to be the Revelation 12 sign that's going to be in the sky. What perfect timing. And I also talked about this in my COINTEL video too, with the McCarran Act, and how this act is also known as the Internal Security Act of 1950 that was also enacted by Truman, and how it has what? Contains an emergency detention statute giving the president the authority to apprehend and detain, quote, each person as to whom there is a reasonable ground to believe that such person probably will engage in or probably will conspire with others to engage in acts of what? Espionage or sabotage, the building blocks of martial law. And when was this effective? Almost 67 years ago, as of September 23rd, 1950. Interesting and suspicious indeed. Now, this also gives a brief overview of the 1033 program, which permits the Secretary of Defense to transfer without charge excess U.S. Department of Defense personal property, supplies, and equipment to state and local law enforcement agencies. And we're doing this, and we see it even when it comes to Texas for what? The building blocks of martial law. We're already seeing it being enacted more and more as they fund for these FEMA camps, just like your president can sign these documents and draconian laws into office, because last I checked, executive orders were unconstitutional. But that's been ripped to shreds long, long ago, before it was even signed by your Freemasonic founding fathers. And then I also briefly talked about this in the Hurricane Harvey video, but will once again reiterate it here, about Congress quietly passing a bill allowing warrantless searches of homes, and only 1% who opposed it the same exact week as all of this is taking place. And of course, this hardly got any attention because they're trying to only talk about and keep the focus on Hurricane Harvey and not the draconian laws that they're putting in place right about now. And it says right here, a bill that will allow homes to be searched without a warrant has passed with overwhelming support by Congress and signed into law by Trump as of the 22nd of this month. And it happened with no media coverage and very little fanfare. I wonder why. And this is part of the tricks of the enemy, how they try to deceive, because it says on the surface, House Joint Resolution 76 looks harmless. The title of the bill claims that its purpose is, quote, granting the consent and approval of Congress for the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state of Maryland, and the District of Columbia to enter into a compact relating to the establishment of the Washington Metro Rail Safety Commission. And so they want you to think that, oh, it just has to do with metro rails and the railroad system, and oh, there's nothing to it. But if you keep going, it says the proposal for a safety commission to act as a wing of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority may sound logical when its power includes things such as the ability to, quote, adopt, revise, and distribute a written state safety oversight program, and to, quote, renew, approve, oversee, and enforce the adoption and implementation of WMATA's Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. However, there is one major red flag buried within the text of the bill that may stem from the list of powers given to the Washington Metro Rail Safety Commission, and it violates one of the basic tenets of the Constitution, but we know they don't even keep the Constitution, nor do they follow it. And it's this paragraph right here where it says, in performing its duties, the Commission, through its board or designated employees or agents, may enter upon the WMATA rail system, and upon reasonable notice and a finding by the Chief Executive Order that a need exists, upon any lands, waters, and premises adjacent to the rail system, including without limitation, property owned or occupied by the federal government, and just look up some other unconstitutional executive orders that were passed by your lovely presidents, and you'll see how your federal government even owns and controls you, your home, your children, local railroads, and any other places that they deem necessary in a so-called state of emergency for the purpose of making inspections, investigations, examinations, and testing as the Commission may deem necessary to carry out the purposes of this MSC Compact, and such entry shall not be deemed a trespass. The text gives the Commission the authority to enter property near the Metro Rail system, quote, without limitation and without a warrant for the purpose of, quote, making inspections, investigations, examinations, and testing. However, this clearly goes against the Fourth Commandment, which states that Americans' rights, quote, to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. Now here is the actual Congress bill, and I'll be sure to link it in the description box below. Now what they're also good at doing is they're good at using legalese, and they're good at using very deceptive terms and very deceptive language to place and implement into their documents and their draconian laws, like this one that was signed into law, by the way. And as you can see right here, this was signed into law and became a law as of 8/22/2017, signed by Trump right before Hurricane Harvey hit. But did they know about Hurricane Harvey already? But now we're going to briefly go over Article 4, Powers, and we're going to go over numbers 31 and 32 that talked about what we just read in the article before, where it says, in performing its duties, the Commission, through its board or designated employees or agents, may 1. Conduct or cause to be conducted inspections, investigations, examinations, and testing of WMATA personnel and contractors, property, equipment, facilities, rolling stock, and operations of the WMATA rail system, including without limitation electronic information and databases through reasonable means, which may include the issuance of subpoenas. But then it says B, enter upon the WMATA rail system, and upon reasonable notice and a finding by the Chief Executive Officer that a need exists, upon any lands, waters, and premises adjacent to the WMATA rail system, including without limitation property owned or occupied by the federal government for the purpose of making inspections, investigations, examinations, and testing as the Commission may deem necessary to carry out the purposes of this MSC Compact, and such entry shall not be deemed a trespass. The Commission shall make reasonable reimbursement for any actual damage resulting to any such adjacent lands, waters, and premises as a result of such activities. But like I've also talked about before, when it comes to FEMA camps, your government has already signed in and issued draconian executive orders that already state that they have the so-called legal right to control you and your home and whatever it is that you own in a so-called state of emergency. And we see how all of this looks to be planned and staged and tested right before our eyes with Hurricane Harvey, because there were states of emergency declared in many of those counties. And we see that Walmart and FEMA are already on the scene and are going to stay there for years. You just heard what your Attorney General said, where Jeff Sessions made the statement that they're already using these weapons in the militarization of police in areas in Texas. What does all of this sound like to you? What are they getting ready for? Please seek Yahuwah and his true son Yahusha, because as you see with all of the draconian laws, they're obviously leading up to bigger and badder things. But thankfully with Yahuwah and his true son Yahusha, we are protected at all times. This is Truth Unveiled here, keeping you updated and saying as always, Shalom.